Today we will be going through the very basics of Photoshop and looking at Photoshop as a tool to edit photographs. If you want to do illustration for the purposes of this class, use Illustrator. There are a lot of people that do use Photoshop for drawing and painting and things of that nature. We will not be covering them in here. We will be using Photoshop for photos. So I've gone ahead and opened a photo here. To do that, we can simply go File, Open, and it will give us the option. We can bring in pretty much any file type. Be a little cautious with that, but pretty much any file type will open just fine in here. Our basic maneuvering, zoom out, zoom in, works just the same as Illustrator. Command plus or minus. Command 0 returns us to a full screen. If you notice it cuts off a little bit of this side, that's because I'm at a little bit lower resolution than it wants. So I can just use the space bar and move my image to where I can see everything, and it makes me happy. Alright, we're not going to worry about layers yet. We're just going to go in and use a variety of tools that are kind of just the overall editing tools. And that's the image adjustments. It's this list of editing options. And I'm just going to go through and kind of play with these and tell you about what each one does and where you would use them. I'll skip a few. But these are most of these you'll have some familiarity with because these are what is available in most photo editing apps on your phone or in most social media applications as well. First and simplest, we're just going to run through these. This image I found in the background is just a picture I took a long time ago. I picked it just because it has these really heavy grays all throughout and just a little bit of color. But you can pick whatever image you want to follow along with and it will work just fine. So here we have brightness and contrast. Brightness moves the entire image towards white, essentially. The entire image towards white. It biases a little bit towards the bright colors, but not terribly. And then contrast is moving the light parts towards white and moving the dark parts towards black. Of course, if I go brightness the other way, it just moves everything dark. Contrast moves whites towards white, moves blacks towards black. If I reduce contrast, it pushes everything towards gray. In this image, you'll notice that I have these areas of heavy black that, no matter what, this area here is always going to stay black because that is just what it is in the image. It's a 000 RGB color. There is no light there at all. It will not come up without editing that. We'll get there. All right. If when you do this, your computer gets upset, you might be able to see mine stuttering a little bit. You can turn off preview, and then this will slide much more smoothly. And then you can turn preview on. You can also use this if you're making a multiple edit. Let's say you're going to do both of these things, and you need to check it. Well, you can check this versus your original by just turning preview on and off. Right? Just keep tapping that on and off, and you can say, well, do I like my edit? Do I like the original? Do I like my edit? Do I like my original? Alright, I do not, so I'm just going to hit cancel. These first four are going to be pretty much exactly the same tool, just with more knobs. Gets the same thing done, just many more options for each one. We have quite a few more things here. We also have this window. This window is new. This window is a histogram. A histogram simply shows you how much of each level of pixel there is in the image, with fully black pixels being over here, fully white pixels being over here, and gray pixels being here in the middle. So this gives us an idea of where the amount of each thing is. So you can see that there's actually only a little bit of true black in this image, and then there's a whole lot of dark gray, which is going to be most of this area. And then there's a whole lot of these two peaks here are going to be this gray and then this medium light gray and the highlights in this water are all represented in these two high peaks here. You can see there's almost no whites in this image. There's only the tiny little bit here and the highlight right here on this sail, but there's almost none. And that really, in most images, you don't want this. You want a much more full histogram, but in this I wanted it to have that kind of stormy dark look. So everything gets shoved down and it looks like this, and the histogram looks like this. So do realize that this image was edited previously, and that's why we're going to see a little bit of weirdness when we edit this. Now, if I wanted to expand out this histogram and make it fill the image, all I have to do, take this white, bring it back to here, and now my image eats up the whole, right? I've taken this wall, and I've moved this wall to here. Now I have very bright whites right here in the middle. Whites that are almost as white as, you know, just screen white, which is this color right there. If I hit preview, turn preview off, right, returns me to my original, you can see that I've bumped up the tone in the image quite a bit. One thing to notice, if you look in the dark areas, I've not really edited those. One thing to note, this middle gray will move when I move this. But if I don't want it, I can now grab this separately and put it back to where it was. Right, but that's going to give me a very, very high contrast image. Output levels. Down here, simply tell the computer where I want white to be and where I want black to be. If I leave it alone, my blacks will be black and my whites will be white. If I mess with this, my blacks will be gray and my whites will go towards gray. So you can see that I'm bringing all the whites and all the blacks out of this image and just doing the grays in the middle. This is very similar to reducing the contrast, but not quite. This is much more of a hard wall at each of these points than the gradation that is in the contrast tool. Okay. You can also use this. You can bring up, get these blacks much heavier in here. One thing we can also do is we can individually edit each channel. If I just want to see the reds in the image, now remember, because there's so much gray, my red, green, and blue are going to look very similar because you mix those three together evenly to make what looks like gray. But if I edit just the red, you can see that I can get interesting color things happening. Right? I can shift the sky red and the water green blue just by moving these two. Right? Can get an even stronger contrast there by moving this more aggressively. So we can do interesting things with this just by messing with these. We can get what look like filter effects that we're used to from social media apps. And if I want to reset this just type in 0.5. Oop, I do not want to do that. Command Z. Alright, well, we're done with that anyway. So onwards to the next thing. That was levels. Now we're on to curves. Curves is an even fancier version of the same thing. We have our histogram. You can see that it is that same triple peak look. It's much taller now, but that's just so it fits this graph. It fits this shape. Now, instead of just having the black, white, and gray markers, now I can select and I can put these little knots on this line and I can move it. So this is going to give me a very smooth adjustment. If I pull it down, darkens the image. If I push it up, it lightens the image. Right? If I want more contrast, all I have to do is put 3 knots, and I make my lights lighter, and I make my darks darker. And so this gives me a lot of freedom as I can, bring all of this over. I can lighten up the image in a way that looks different than just the brightness adjustment or the contrast adjustment that we saw, or even just bringing the white point over. So I've not changed my white point. My white point is identical. I'm moving all of these pixels, all the pixels that are in this very bright range, up quite a bit, as you can see here. Yeah, right. Any pixel that is of this value is getting moved up that much. So realize that this is a smoother way to do it. You can, however, cause a lot of problems. You can reduce contrast doing the opposite thing. See, we're doing a reduction in contrast. It looks a little odd though. And if this line ever goes above horizontal, it starts to get really strange. The image just gets weird. You can do some neat things with that, but it is generally just very strange looking. Again, you can go in here and select any of the individual color paths if you want. But in the interest of moving forward, we will do that thing. I'm going to hit cancel. Exposure is a slightly fancier version of brightness. It's going to do something very similar to just putting a knot in the top right hand corner of that curve and bringing it up if we move our exposure up. One of big things I don't like about this tool is if you watch the background as I bring this up, it starts to destroy the detail in there. So this is probably my least favorite tool of this set versus, or this is less good than curves for doing a similar thing because it is so easy to just blow out big chunks of your image. Okay, console. Now, as I'm going through these, I'm just kind of showing you how to muck up an image. But this image has already been edited to something that I want. This will be much more important to think about what each of these things does when we're trying to get images to lay on top of each other and match. Vibrance and saturation. These two things might not seem different to one another, but they really, really are. Saturation, much in the same way that brightness contrast, that the contrast moves pixels that are greater than 50% gray towards white and moves pixels that are less than 50% gray towards black. Saturation does the same thing, but for colors. Any color will move towards a more pure version of that color, a less gray version of that color. So if we watch these already bright colors in the sail and move our saturation, we can see that those are now very, very bright. Click off preview, see how gray it looks. Then take those bright colors and push them very, very bright. I'm going to undo that. Vibrance does something different. Vibrance does not mess with the colors that are already very bright. What Vibrance does is it takes all those colors at the core, all those grays and browns, and it pushes those outwards towards their maximum color. But again, it leaves the colors that are already relatively bright alone. So what I want you to do is watch the water, which will turn green, and watch these edges in the clouds, which I think this one will turn purple and this one might turn green, as I move Vibrance. So you can see that this is JPEG artifacts, but you can see the purple chunks in this cloud. And look at all the green in the water now. All this gray was very, very slightly green, and it shifts that way out to be a chromatic green. I turn that off, gray, see the green. No green, green. You can also see some interesting things. There's some color right here in the sail that will come out. See this almost rainbow effect? But look at these bright colors. They don't really change all that much. They change a little bit, don't get me wrong, but not nearly as much as if we crank out that saturation. And of course, if we do both like this, we get the movement of the vibrance and the movement of the saturation. So these colors get extremely bright and very awful and spotty. Not going to do that. So if you're editing something like a flower that already has bright colors, don't use saturation. Use vibrance to bump everything. If you use saturation, you'll actually overdrive your colors, and they'll look very fake. Hue saturation. Saturation here is the same tool that we were just playing with. Right? I can use this to make a black and white image. Do not use this to make a black and white image. This is not how we make black and white images. But this does the exact same thing that our other tool does. It's a little more powerful. You can see that, you know, if I crank saturation all the way out, it kind of loses its mind. This is a much more powerful version of that same tool. And by power, I just mean like horsepower, not ability, skill, or desirability. You really need to be careful when you're using this, whereas the other tool gives you a little bit more leeway. All right, leave that alone. Hue is interesting. If you look at this, this is essentially if you took a color wheel and unrolled it, this is what it would look like, right? Red would come back to red, and it would make our color wheel. So what hue does is it takes all of the colors in our image, and it just rotates them on the color wheel. So if you think about, like, if you took all the letters in the alphabet and rotated them one letter, A would match B, B would match C, C would match D. This is doing the same thing but with colors. So we're taking this blue color and we are shifting it. So we can shift all the colors in the image. Of course, I only really have a few colors in this image, so it's not going to be extremely bright. But look at what's happening to the colors in that sail. Right? As long as we're hanging out in this middle, we're not really shifting all that far, but you can see that once we get maybe a third of the way across this, we're getting into completely different colors. This is a tool that does need to be used a little cautiously, but once you get the hang of it, it can be really helpful for trying to match one image into another image. Cancel. Color balance. This gives us a more specific version of that same thing. Instead of taking all the colors on the color wheel and just spinning them, we can now have 3 sliders. We can think of these 3 sliders as making up a 6-pointed star, right? Like one of these would be this way, one of these would be this way, and one of these would be this way. And that will allow us to shift all the colors one direction or another. So if I want to take all the red to cyan, right, which is really going to affect this quite a bit, I can do that. Now you can see it's shifting the entire image, but that's again because grays are mixes of all 3 colors. It's a mix of red, green, and blue. But you can see the shift. I go red, I can do that. Magenta, green. So if we need a more precise idea of what color we need to shift, right? If I need to match this into a blue page, well, this can just be cranked up until it does what I want. One thing we can also do is we can do tone balance. I would leave preserve luminosity on. It's just going to work better for most people, for most purposes. If you need to turn it off, you'll know that. But we can do just specific things. So if I want my shadows to be warm, I can just make my shadows warm. And then I can use my midtones, and I can bring those back to blue, and I can get a very like 70s, maybe 60s, 70s look of like film photography by shifting the way those colors work. And really what that takes is looking at an image you want to copy, or a style of image you want to copy, and figuring out what do they do to get that, right? Are these shadows warm? Are these shadows cool? Are the highlights warm or cool? How did they pull off this style? There was a little while where every movie kind of had an orange-blue aesthetic to it, and so that's something to look at. Is I think action movies from maybe 5 years ago, all orange-blue. Maybe even a little older. But yeah, so we can specifically go through. So if I want to cool those shadows, I can do that. Make my highlights warm, and that gives me a completely different look of image. Alright, not going to do that. Now, this guy, black and white. This is how we're going to make black and white images. Okay, no preview. I'm going to turn my preview on. What this allows you to do is, much like a musician can mix different instruments in, this allows you to mix in your different colors into your final black and white image. So now, where I have the most red is in that sail, right here. So if I make this red go towards white, that will mix red as a lighter color. See, I can bump. So if I want that stripe to be less apparent, of course you're seeing a lot of JPEG artifacts in there, but you can make that stripe less apparent just by bringing this one thing up. In this image it's very aggressive, but in some things, like with trees, it's a really nice way to get certain things to pop. So I'm going to bring that, if I bring it down, I can make that stripe much more apparent. I can make that very aggressive. Same thing with yellows. We can find our yellows. Can pop our yellows out. See our greens. And some of this just kind of does take playing with it, right? Green doesn't really seem to be moving our image too much. Let's try cyan. See if I can actually click it. So cyan seems to mainly be in the sky. I'm going to leave that alone. Blues. Kind of like that heavier sky of the darker. The magenta darkens up the sail a little bit as well. So now you can see that I have a black and white image that's mixed to kind of pop this out of the water. Since I don't have the color to pop it out of the rest of the image, I can now use this mixer to bring the reds down, the yellows up, and the blues down to kind of get that, to get the sailor to pop off of the image. Gonna skip these, just not useful for what we're doing in this class. This one, very simple, just inverts the image. Right. Just switches everything across the color wheel and across the across light dark, just mirrors it. Nice and simple. One nice thing about that is it is undoable. If you do it one way, you can switch back and go the other way as well. Posterize is something we're not really going to use in this class, but it can make kind of a cool effect depending on what you want to do with it. I do not like it. I find it very ugly. But it is there. I will not speak of it. Threshold is an interesting one. This again uses our little histogram friend. Everything to this side of this triangle is black. Everything to this side of this triangle is white. This has a lot of uses in masking and things like that. We won't be getting into doing a lot of the automated masking. We'll be doing most of ours by hand. But this is one of the big things that you use threshold for, is automating your masking. You can also use it to make very simple prints, right? Like I can make something that looks like it would be printed on like an old flyer or an old album cover or something like that, just by finding a good point where I get detail, right? Like that's kind of an interesting image. Or you can make something that is completely, you can't see anything, right? That's useless, doesn't do anything for us. But I can get some very interesting art on the lighter end of this. Of course, depending on your image, yours might be better over here, just depends. Right, so that gives me something interesting with this tool, but it just depends on what you're going to use it for, where you're going to use it. It's got a very Xerox flavor, right? Like photocopy something over and over and over again and you get this really destroyed image, this is one of the things that this tool can make very quickly and fake very quickly. Gradient map, one of those great tools that can be used for great evil. You can get into these really silly psychedelic things. Some of them can make really interesting art, but most of the time you're just going to make things that look crazy. And that's fine. You can do that. Oh, this is foreground to transparent. I should have put this over a white image. One important thing about foreground to transparent is that, or sorry, foreground black to transparent, is that it allows you to use this filter to set this image over another image. And instead of doing a mix, you can use that to do a mix instead. So that's an interesting way of doing it. There's also the chrome, which is neat, but God, it's ugly. If you use this one, it pretty much just gives you a black and white image. If you want more gradients than what is offered here, you can go to this. You can find all of your extra ones in here. There will be all sorts, and then if you get sad and don't want those anymore, you can just reset your gradients back to stock, and it will give you your standard ones back. Cancel. Selective color is fine. It's much better to do by hand later, which we will do. I would prefer you not use this filter because it's just kind of lazy. Shadows and highlights. Shadows and highlights is something that we've gotten used to having on our phones. This was essentially magic when it came out, but now it's wonderful. Allows you to just get more details back out of your shadows and out of your highlights. So if I turn this off, right, 0%, all this dark area is hidden in shadow. Well, I can actually bring that out. So now I can actually see the detail of this image on the bottom of the board. I can see the edge, the highlighted edge of the shadows and everything like that. I'm bringing in detail to the shadows. Now, most digital cameras are going to have very noisy shadows, which means when you do this, you are going to get lots of brightly colored junk in these shadows. So just be cautious about doing this too much. You will end up with brightly colored fuzz or noise in your shadows. You can also do the same thing to highlights. However, realize that highlights on a digital camera, once you are at that far right hand side of the histogram, there is nothing recoverable in that image. So highlights, while they work a little bit, are not going to do the same kind of magic that the shadows can. So just be cautious about that. If you have the choice of underexposing or overexposing an image on a digital camera, underexpose the image every time. It might take a lot of work, but you can save it. An overexposed image is unrecoverable. Well, not entirely unrecoverable. It's unrecoverable by most people with a reasonable amount of time. Desaturate is another way to remove color out of an image. It's essentially just going to the saturation tool and knocking it down. But we're not going to do that because we are going to use our black and white tool when we need to make black and white images. Now, that set is the absolute basics of the adjustments in Photoshop, but I want you to get a good feel for how each of them work and how each of them changes the image slightly differently, right? These four do almost exactly the same thing, but everyone's got a few different knobs. These ones do almost exactly this. These three do almost exactly the same thing, but they have different knobs. Learn the black and white tool. It is wonderful. These tools, not as useful, silly, a lot of fun. And shadows highlights is good for saving those shadows and highlights, but you can also use things like curves to do something very, very similar to your shadows and highlights. So your homework is to take 10 images. You're going to use your phone, camera, whatever. Take 10 pictures. In Photoshop, you are going to edit those using only these tools that I've shown you today. With that, you are going to make 5 that are simply edited to the way that you want to see the picture. Right? This image is just what I saw that day. That's what I think looks good. That's what I like. 5 of those. Then what I would like you to do is make me 3 black and whites. 3 black and white images. Those 3 black and white images will be done with our black and white tool. If you need to do levels or anything like that beforehand or afterwards, go ahead and do that. But you must use this tool. Do not just pull down saturation, and do not use the desaturate tool. Use the black and white tool. Learn how it works. I want 3 of those. And then the last thing I want you to do is just go insane on 2 images. Make the most psychedelic, crazy, absurd images you can, but make something that to you looks good, right, fun, interesting. Don't just make a crazy thing that looks awful. Make a crazy thing that looks neat. So that's your 10. 5 real ones, 3 black and white, and 2 crazy ones.